Welcome everyone to IAG's Trade Talk. My name is Ben Blaschke, Managing Editor of Inside Asian Gaming, and another busy week in the global gaming industry, of course. And the big news out of Australia early this week was the release of the Royal Commission findings into Crown Melbourne. Quite an interesting and some might say surprising outcome. Of course, the findings from Commissioner Finkelstein found that Crown Melbourne was unsuitable to retain its Melbourne casino licence, but hasn't actually lost its licence at this point. Instead, there's been an independent monitor or a special manager that's been appointed to oversee Crown for 2 years. Crown basically has 2 years to get its house in order, and then it will basically be determined by the special manager whether they have reformed and can continue to operate Crown Melbourne. Very pleased, of course, to welcome a special guest today to talk a little bit about these developments, former CEO and Executive Commissioner of Victoria's State Gaming Regulator, Peter Cohen. How are you, Peter?
I'm very good, Ben. Nice to be with you.
Well, we've got lots to talk about, Peter. I'm not sure how much we'll get through. Let's start quite generally. What's your reaction to the findings of the Royal Commission in general?
I think the findings are probably as expected, with a little bit of unusual components to it that we weren't possibly able to consider. I think the decision that the Commissioner has come to is the logical one. He's recognised that Crown, the complex, so the Crown Casino complex, is an integral part of Melbourne today, and therefore there are good reasons to allow it to keep going, because it's more than just a casino. As we all know, it's got 3 hotels and restaurants and retail, conference facilities, banquet facilities. It employs 11,000 or more people, and it's become something that people in Melbourne have grown used to. So he sees there's a need for that to continue. The question becomes whether the person that's got the rights to operate the casino part of that complex should continue to have it. And it's already got the rights to continue to operate the hotels and the banquets and everything else. So it becomes complicated if you remove that right from the same owner to operate the casino as can operate the rest of the facility. So what he's done, I think, is probably the most sensible option. And let's make no mistake, Crown is on notice here, because he has said that license that they've got will expire in 2 years' time unless you do something to prove that you're suitable to have it. So it's the default position is loss of license in 2 years, not retention of license. And there's a limited number of ways in which the regulator who makes the decision in 2 years' time can form that view. The Commissioner has made it quite clear that the regulator is only to consider 4 things, and that is the 3 current or past inquiries. So that's the Bergen Inquiry, the Victorian Royal Commission, and the Western Australian Royal Commission, plus the report that the regulator will receive from this position, the special manager. And so that's it. Crown does not get any other opportunities to make presentations or to be heard. Neither is there any need for further public inquiries, expressions of interest from public groups, or anything else. It's a very limited set of information sources that's going to be available to the regulator. And so at this moment, they are still on track, if you like, to lose their license unless they can positively confirm to the special manager that they have done everything that's necessary over the next 2 years to make them suitable to get their license back. They're not home free, I'll put it to you that way.
Sure. So, the challenge has been set for Crown. They did ask in their closing submissions, Crown, at the Royal Commission, for an independent monitor to be the way forward rather than suspension or loss of license. So, given that scenario, is this sort of the best possible scenario that Crown could have hoped for?
I think they would have probably preferred a monitor that didn't have quite the power of the special manager. But on balance, that's a minor issue. This is a pretty good outcome for Crown, given the various other options that could have occurred. The special manager, I can see the reason for the special manager being appointed, and that's because if you had decided instead to suspend the license for 2 years and then give Crown the opportunity to get it back at the end of that time, the problem, and Finkelstein mentions this in his report, the problem is that whilst it's suspended and another manager is appointed, Crown can't prove to anyone that they've reformed their ways because they're not managing the casino. The staff aren't working for them, they're working for whoever has been appointed if the license is suspended. So this is a quite clever and neat way around what I think is a flaw in the legislation that no one had actually been able to foresee, because we never thought it was ever going to be used. That it's not really a suspension, but in a way it has the same management role that a manager might have, but keeps Crown in the loop. So the board of directors are somewhat hamstrung. They can't do everything they necessarily would like to do, but they are still in a position of making decisions which the special manager can overturn if he sees fit.
Yeah, I mean, let's delve a little bit deeper into this special manager, Peter, because as you say, it's a very unique situation. So Stephen O'Brien is the person that's been chosen and named as the special manager. He's former head of Victoria's Anti-Corruption Commission, a very experienced and well-respected guy, Stephen O'Brien. But what exactly is his role within Crown, and how do you see this working practically?
He really becomes a de facto in-house regulator, gaming regulator. And he's actually working inside Crown rather than for the gaming regulator. He's separate from the gaming regulator. And the gaming regulator still has responsibilities to regulate all the various things that a casino might do, to make sure that the games are played properly and that the tax is verified and collected and so on. But the special manager is really responsible for the direction that the company sets, ensuring that the board make the right decisions from here on, that the relationship between Crown and the regulator improves from what it had been. And we should point out that there has been a lot of change since this Royal Commission started. Crown today is not the company it was when the Royal Commission started or when Bergen started. It's come a long way already. So his job is to ensure that there's a better relationship between Crown at the board level and at the senior management level and the regulator and other law enforcement, such as AUSTRAC and the police. And he has the ability to say to Crown, you can't do what you wanted to do. If the board wanted to make a decision that he thought was inappropriate, he can overrule that decision. But the board is still the one that has to make decisions, but he can overrule them if he thinks that they're going in the wrong direction.
I mean, that's an interesting point, Peter. There's been some reports in Australian media today effectively querying whether the Crown board becomes impotent, given that Stephen O'Brien effectively has final say. What are your thoughts on that view?
We're all in new territory here, so we don't actually know what it means for the board. I know there is some view that perhaps the board of directors might even feel that their job is so constrained, perhaps they don't want to do it anymore. I don't know about that. There's another view that ASIC, the Australian corporate regulator, might have some difficulty with a board that's been constrained in this way as well. But I find it difficult to believe that Commissioner Finkelstein, a former judge, would have done something that he would realise it wouldn't work on that basis. So on face value, I think it can work, but I think it takes a lot of the Crown Melbourne directors really have to go into this with an understanding that in some respect their hands are tied, but in another respect they're being protected by the special manager. It's a complicated story for them, and it's probably just as complicated for the special manager.
Given that Stephen O'Brien, as I said, he has a lot of control here, but he doesn't have direct casino experience. Is that a concern as well in terms of the power over control, or the control that he effectively has at this stage?
It doesn't have to be a concern. The government introduced into the Parliament yesterday the legislation to create the role of the special manager, so amending the Casino Control Act to tell us what those powers will be. And it's quite clear from that the special manager can appoint whoever he likes to assist him. So he could quite simply appoint some experienced casino operators or casino regulators to assist him on the more technical casino stuff if he felt it was necessary. So the fact that he doesn't have casino experience, I don't think precludes him from being able to do the role that's necessary and as foreseen by the Commissioner.
Sure. As I mentioned before too, Peter, Stephen O'Brien is former head of Victoria's Anti-Corruption Commission. Does that in itself, and the selection of him, personally, does that tell us something as well?
I think it tells us that the government wanted a strong figure who was beyond reproach. The Commissioner's report identified the special manager potentially being a company rather than an individual, but the government has gone instead with an individual with a very strong reputation, and particularly in the anti-corruption side. And I think that sends a strong message that Crown's behaviour, or the concerns that the government have got based on the reports from both Bergen and from Commissioner Finkelstein, are such that they wanted the corruption side to be strongly understood. That in other words, Crown's behaviours with respect to its dealings with regulators are something that's very strong concern. That's not to say the government is not concerned with all the other aspects that have been raised, the responsible gambling concerns and the avoidance of tax or evasion of tax and so on. I just think they want it to be seen that there's a person that they've put inside the casino operator who is beyond reproach.
Sure. Now, there are a number of other important recommendations contained within the Finkelstein report, of course. As a former head of the regulator yourself, Peter, I'm very interested to get your thoughts on the pros and cons of some of these. First of all, I think we saw it coming, but the banning of junkets, what are your thoughts on that?
It's no surprise. Crown has said they don't want to deal with junkets until they're licensed in Victoria, and there is no licensing scheme in Victoria anyway. So this, in some respects, just puts a full stop on something that was already in place. I think it's a good move. I mean, junkets have probably had their day anyway, I suspect, as a business model, probably all around the world. I think that business is sort of gradually dying for a number of different reasons, but one of them is you've got free and independent travellers who can make their own decisions about whether they choose to travel to casinos around the world and how much they want to gamble, and can find the ways and means to do that. So I'm not sure that there was much of a future for junket play anyway, but given the problems that we've seen that the junkets have had, I think it's a sensible solution. Junkets should never have been allowed to operate inside the Australian casinos in the first place. They should have been allowed to deliver their players, but not have their own room. And that was a mistake that was made that compounded a lot of these problems. But getting rid of junkets altogether gets rid of any concerns about that issue.
Sure. Another recommendation has been that all play be carded. So any player that goes in must use a card to play. And at any cash transaction over $1,000 be banned. So, that sort of, you can walk in with a small amount, but not a large amount, and use cash. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very much about money laundering control. It's put in place measures that make it more difficult for people to launder money, irrespective of Crown's responsibility to tell AUSTRAC, the Australian anti-money laundering agency. So it's actually, if you like, going to the source of the problem of trying to prevent money laundering from occurring. But it also it gives the casino operator the ability to track people's play from responsible gambling points of view as well. They've got that data that they can get from the carded play will give them the ability to know when a player might have changed their pattern in a way that should raise a flag of concern, which is something that the gaming regulators have been talking to Crown about for 15 years, probably, making better use of the data they have on their loyalty scheme to use it for responsible gambling administrative purposes. This should help them with that. The irony of this issue of going cashless, though, is that in doing so, they're doing the industry a favour, because who do you know under the age of 40 carries cash anyway? So the industry has to go cashless. It's not going to survive if it doesn't. So this decision to require cashless over $1,000 will probably find its way through to under $1,000 in time, because that's what the players themselves are going to want.
Yeah, and I think both Crown and Star have already agreed with the New South Wales regulator that they're happy to phase out cash too. So, as you say, I think this was coming for sure. So, Peter, the other big one is the maximum fine able to be dished out for breaches. It was $1 million, which a lot of people saw as particularly low. Well, that's been increased to 100 million now. What effect will that have?
It gives the regulator more flexibility to manage any mistakes that the casino makes. Now, let's be clear here. There are mistakes that are made all the time in casinos. They don't always deserve of disciplinary action, and sometimes they do, okay? But the problem the regulator had with a $1 million fine was it couldn't really take strong action for the most egregious breaches. But adding the fine process is a useful tool for regulators. What they do is use it to send a message. So for a first breach of something, let's say dealing with the wrong number of cards in a game of blackjack, You might send a reasonably small message. You might even start with a warning. But if that behaviour keeps happening, you then fine them and you keep increasing the fine to get the operator's attention. And you do that through any licensed operator, whether it's a casino or a gaming venue or a wagering operator. You have this ability to increase your fines to get their attention. And eventually, if it doesn't get their attention, that's when you get to suspension or cancellation as a possibility. For the next 2 years, it will give the regulator the flexibility that they need, because they're actually not able to suspend or cancel the license for anything that's in the Royal Commission report. That's really already been taken into consideration through the appointment of the special manager and the decision to cancel the license in 2 years unless Crown actively does something positive. But it does give the regulator the ability to take stronger action where it feels it's necessary. And I think that's a good thing. Remember that 1 million was put in place in the enabling legislation of 1991. We've moved a long way since then in the value of the dollar, and it should have been raised years ago. The fact that it's gone to 100 million, I think, is a good thing. I'm not even sure it needed to have a limit. It could have been open-ended, would have been fine with me as a regulator. But 100 million does send a message to Crown that you could be fined up to that amount of money. That's a story.
It's quite substantial. Peter, there are also quite a few concerns expressed during the Royal Commission about how cooperation was between Crown and the regulator. Perhaps their relationship or cooperation relationship wasn't as strong as it could have been, and that Crown may not have been as forthcoming with information as it might have been. Are you satisfied this has been addressed with these recommendations?
Yes, I am. And the special managers, that's one of the things the special manager can look at. I'd like to think that the message had got through to Crown already, so that therefore that this is actually a story that no longer needed to be told other than for the purpose of history. You'd like to think that Crown had already got the message, though it was apparent from some of the witness statements presented in the Victoria Royal Commission, it hadn't quite got through as soon as it ought to have got through. But I think it's there now. One of the things that's probably been lost in this is that Crown today, the corporate entity, and Crown Melbourne, which is the subsidiary of the parent company, are very different companies. That there's only one director left from 12 months ago on both the boards of Crown Resorts and Crown Melbourne. Everybody else is a new director. There's none of the senior executives are left operating at Crown Resorts or Crown Melbourne. The CEO's gone, the CFO's gone, the general counsel has gone, the company secretary has gone, the heads of international business have gone. It is a very different company already. And so I'd like to think that with that, there is better behaviour between Crown and the gaming regulator and the other regulators they have to deal with, such as AUSTRAC and the police and so on. So I'd like to think that the change has already happened. When the special manager gets there, he'll be able to see firsthand whether it really has. And if it hasn't, Crown deserves any punishment that follows from that. It's been warned and warned and warned. If it hasn't got the story by now, it's never going to get the story. So I assume it now knows what's appropriate and how it ought to behave with the regulator.
Yeah, I mean, there's also been reform on the regulator side, of course, Peter. It was announced a while ago there'd be a new dedicated casino regulator established. That process is already well underway. How important do you think that part of this whole thing is for moving forward with Crown and the regulator?
The role and structure of the regulator is essential. Now, yes, in yesterday's legislative amending legislation that was introduced to Parliament, all we saw was the change of name. There's obviously more to follow, and the government always said there are two tranches of legislation for this. So what we will see as the function and powers and structure of the new regulator is yet to be made public. It'll be in the second round of legislation. It may be announced. The structure might be announced before that, but it needs to be, the functions and powers need to be legislated, and we need to see what they are. But a lot of it will depend on the personalities of the people that are chosen. I mean, I've seen lots of regulators all around the world, and a lot of it depends very much on the mindset and the approach taken by individuals. So as much as structure and function are important, it will also be important for the government to appoint the right people, and you can't always tell in advance what the right people are. But nevertheless, you'd like to think that we will have people in charge of the Victorian Gambling and Casino Control Commission who are appropriate for the complicated task that's ahead of them. mind you, it's always been complicated. Nothing's changed there for the gaming regulator.
I'm interested in that, Peter. What does appropriate look like in your mind from a regulator's viewpoint?
It's a really good, as I was saying, I was thinking, how would I know whether a person is the right person? I think it's difficult for people to understand who haven't been on the inside, but there are 3 pieces of gaming legislation that a regulator has to deal with. 2 of them are casino related, and the other is the Gaming Regulation Act, which is the biggest piece of legislation the Victorian Parliament has ever enacted. It was only about 630 pages when it passed in 2003. It's now 1,300 pages. And it's not 100% foolproof. So I think what you're looking for is someone with some understanding of the need to be flexible, to make, because you've got to find ways to make the legislative scheme work to the benefit of the community. It's not the benefit of the operators or the benefit of the government, it's to the benefit of the Victorian community. And to do that, you need to have someone who understands that sometimes you're going to have to be flexible, which is a shorthand way of saying you're going to need to understand that what you're doing, some people will argue, isn't consistent with the law, but you've got to do it with the right moral understanding of what that means for the Victorian community, because there are competing parts in the legislation that whichever way you go, you're going to potentially offend the legislation. To give you a real world example, in the early days of gambling law in Victoria, licenses for gaming venues, that's venues with slot machines, could be held by individuals. And we had a lot of our RSLs, our return services clubs, with licenses held by individuals because they were unincorporated associations. What happened when that person died? And they did, because they were old people. And technically their license died, which means that gaming venue couldn't operate. But you needed to be flexible to find a way to allow them to operate, because what was the purpose of closing them just because the license died with the person who passed away? So you need to have a person who understands the need to be flexible. You also need to have someone who comes in who doesn't have a strong anti-gambling position. You need to understand where they stand on gambling and understand that the policy position that the state has is that there will be a casino, and it will be a casino that has 540 tables. I'm going back to the old days, 540 tables and 2,628 poker machines. And there will be a state that has up to 27,500 slot machines in other venues. That person has to understand that those policy settings are set by government, not by the regulator, and you have to work to make it work.
Yeah, it's a good point, Peter. I mean, just lastly, we've talked about the changes that Crown has already put in place and that are still underway. We mentioned that there's 1 of 11 board members that was here 12 months ago is remaining. 10 have departed, so Jane Holton is the only one left. A number of changes to the executive team, of course, as you said, completely new looking company, but it still has a lot to prove over the next 2 years. What does Crown need to do in the next 2 years to prove to Stephen O'Brien and to the government that it has learned from its mistakes and changed?
One of the things that needs to happen over the next 2 years, which will help Crown, is that CPH and James Packer have to reduce their shareholding. It's required under the instructions or the findings of the Royal Commission anyway. But in doing that, they can then prove they're not under the control of CPH, because that's the other matter that was of concern to both the Bergen inquiry and the Royal Commission, was the amount of influence that CPH had, which was beyond what was considered to be acceptable and potentially detrimental to the rights of the rest of the shareholders of Crown. So that has to happen. But as well as that, it has to show a continuing pattern of compliance. They've started well under the new administration. They've got this workflow that they've showed through in their annual general meeting and in other reports, which about 6 different streams of work to show what they're doing in responsible gambling reform, compliance reform, cultural reform, AML reform. They've got to progress all of those. Risk reform is another one that was clearly lacking. So they've got to show that they're more than just statements on a whiteboard, that they're actually achieving visible gains through that process. And that's what I think the special manager has the opportunity to see firsthand. And he can provide his report to the gaming regulator, which by that stage will be the Victorian Gambling and Casino Control Commission. And his report should give the regulator all the information they need to know whether those various things that Crown said they would do in all those areas and anything else that might arise That report will tell us whether the regulator is satisfied that Crown is still suitable or is suitable to return to having a license that's unencumbered by the threat of loss.